The American Old West is one of the most mythologized eras in history. Thanks to dime novels, Wild West shows, and generations of Hollywood westerns, we've been fed a steady diet of dusty streets, lightning-fast gunfights, and fearless cowboys living by the six-shooter. But the real Old West was far stranger, quieter, and often far less glamorous than the legends would have us believe. Many of the facts we accept as a truth today are actually exaggerated, misunderstood, or completely fabricated over time. In this video, we're tearing down the legends and exposing 8 ridiculous myths everyone still believes about the Old West, and the surprising realities that history actually left behind. Before we dive in, leave a comment and tell us which Old West myth you grew up believing was true. And if you enjoy uncovering the real history behind America's most legendary frontier, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the myths, facts, and forgotten truths of the Old West. Few eras in American history have captured the public imagination quite like the Old West. Over time, this period has been reshaped by storytelling, popular culture, and nostalgia, often blurring the line between historical reality and legend. The roots of Western expansion began with European colonial settlements in North America during the early 1600s. However, what historians typically identify as the classic Old West, the age most associated with cowboys, frontier towns, mining camps, and wandering outlaws, largely unfolded between the 1850s and the early 20th century. This era coincided with westward migration, railroad expansion, and the rapid development of new settlements across the Great Plains and beyond. Much of what the public believes about the Old West comes not from historical records, but from dime novels, Wild West shows, and later Hollywood films. These sources often portrayed the frontier as an untamed wilderness dominated by fearless individuals who shaped the land through grit and determination. While entertaining, these portrayals frequently simplified or distorted daily life on the frontier. In reality, the West was far more complex and orderly than popular myths suggest. Communities relied on cooperation, economic necessity, and established social norms to survive. Yet the powerful images created by popular media proved remarkably durable, embedding themselves deeply into American cultural identity despite their many inaccuracies. As a result, numerous misconceptions about the Old West continue to be accepted as fact today. Below are 8 of the most common myths, examined through the lens of historical evidence and corrected by what scholars and primary sources actually reveal. Number 1. Wild West cowboys wore cowboy hats. When people picture a cowboy, the image is almost always completed by a wide-brimmed hat. Yet the familiar cowboy hat most of us recognize today was not a standard part of frontier life during much of the Old West period. The Stetson hat, often associated with Western identity, did not appear on the market until 1865. Even then, early Stetson models looked quite different from the classic designs seen in movies and artwork. They featured tall, rounded crowns and lacked the creases that later became a defining characteristic of cowboy hats. In practice, many working cowboys favored other styles that were more practical for daily use. One of the most common was the derby, also known as the bowler hat. Its firm shape and snug fit made it less likely to be knocked loose by strong winds or the motion of horseback riding, which were constant realities on the frontier. Historical photographs and written accounts show that a number of well-known figures of the Old West regularly wore bowler hats rather than wide-brimmed Western styles. Individuals such as Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Black Bart, and Billy the Kid are all documented wearing derby hats, underscoring how different real frontier fashion was from the popular image that developed later. Number 2. Quick-draw gun duels were common. Face-to-face quick-draw duels are a familiar feature of Western dime novels and classic films. These scenes usually show 2 calm, determined gunmen standing alone in a dusty street, while townspeople nervously observe from behind doors and windows. Over time, this image has become one of the most enduring symbols of the Old West. Historical evidence, however, suggests that such encounters were extremely rare. Real confrontations on the frontier were far less orderly and seldom followed a set pattern. They tended to unfold suddenly, often involved multiple participants, and lacked the careful timing and dramatic pauses popularized by later storytelling. Most frontier disputes were resolved quickly and unpredictably, shaped by circumstance rather than ritual. The slow, high-noon standoff so common in movies reflects creative invention more than documented reality, and it owes much to later entertainment rather than contemporary accounts. One of the few well-documented exceptions, often cited by historians, is the 1865 encounter between Wild Bill Hickok and gambler Davis Tutt in Springfield, Missouri. This unusual, structured exchange in a public setting stood out precisely because it was so uncommon. Its notoriety helped fuel the legend of the classic duel and played a significant role in shaping how the Old West has been remembered ever since. Number 3. Banks were easy pickings. Popular Western films and novels often suggest that bank robbery was a routine activity on the frontier, almost a rite of passage for anyone labeled an outlaw. These stories typically depict dramatic daytime raids, followed by daring escapes and effortless disappearances into open country. Over time, this narrative became one of the most recognizable tropes of the Old West. Historical records tell a very different story. In reality, bank robberies were surprisingly uncommon across frontier regions during the 19th century. Many Western towns did not even have permanent banks until late in their development, and those that did often handled limited amounts of cash. Most financial transactions were conducted through credit, trade, or regional banking hubs rather than local vaults filled with money. According to historian Larry Schweikart, fewer than 10 confirmed bank robberies occurred between 1859 and 1900 across 15 frontier states. While some historians suggest the total number may have been slightly higher, even the most generous estimates fall far short of popular imagination. Compared to modern crime statistics, the frequency remains remarkably low. Several practical factors help explain this rarity. Frontier banks were often small, poorly capitalized, and closely monitored by tight-knit communities where strangers stood out immediately. Law enforcement response, though limited, was often swift and supported by local citizens who had a strong incentive to protect their town's financial stability. In contrast, stagecoaches, payroll shipments, and livestock theft presented more accessible opportunities and carried less symbolic risk. Schweikart famously noted that a single modern American city can experience more bank robberies in one year than occurred across the entire Old West over a decade, possibly even throughout the whole frontier period. This comparison underscores how deeply exaggerated the Hollywood version of frontier crime truly is. The enduring image of frequent bank robberies owes more to storytelling convenience than historical reality. Dime novels and later films amplified rare events into defining characteristics of an era, transforming isolated incidents into assumed norms. As a result, modern audiences often confuse myth with fact, overlooking how structured and cautious frontier communities actually were when it came to safeguarding their financial institutions. Number 4, cowboys frequently fought with Indians. Popular culture has long promoted a simplified cowboys versus Indians narrative, suggesting constant conflict between frontier workers and indigenous peoples. This portrayal, reinforced by dime novels and later Western films, has become one of the most enduring misconceptions about life in the American West. Even the terminology reflects early misunderstandings. The word Indian originated with Christopher Columbus, who mistakenly believed he had reached South Asia when he arrived in the Americas and referred to the indigenous population as Indios. Despite the error, the term persisted in European and American usage for centuries, shaping how native peoples were described and perceived. In reality, cowboys rarely engaged in direct confrontations with indigenous groups. Cowboys were primarily wage laborers tasked with moving livestock over long distances, and their livelihoods depended on avoiding unnecessary risks. When tensions arose in frontier regions, ranch hands generally steered clear of potentially dangerous situations and preferred that military forces or government officials handle broader disputes. While strains did exist between ranchers, settlers, and native communities, often driven by land use, broken treaties, and resource competition. These tensions did not translate into constant clashes. Daily frontier life required practical coexistence more often than confrontation. Cowboys focused on their work, and indigenous groups pursued survival strategies shaped by trade, diplomacy, and adaptation to changing conditions. The image of frequent attacks on pioneer wagon trains is also greatly exaggerated. Historical records indicate that most wagon trains passed through indigenous territories without incident. In many cases, native communities tolerated these movements or engaged in trade rather than hostility. Encounters were far more likely to involve negotiation or exchange than aggression. Between 1840 and 1860, documented deaths among immigrants attributed to Native Americans numbered 362, while even more indigenous people died as a result of immigrant activity during the same period. When viewed in context, these figures reveal that such encounters were relatively rare compared to other everyday dangers of westward travel. Disease, river crossings, hunting mishaps, exposure, and falls from horses pose far greater risks to settlers than interactions with native peoples. This statistical reality highlights how misleading popular narratives have been. The Old West was shaped far more by hardship, environmental danger, and social change than by constant conflict between cowboys and indigenous communities. The myth persists largely because it offered a dramatic storyline that appealed to audiences, not because it accurately reflected historical experience. Number 5. Everyone was packing a six-shooter. Popular Western films often give the impression that nearly everyone on the frontier openly carried a revolver or rifle at all times. Cowboys, travelers, and strangers are routinely shown moving freely through towns while fully armed, reinforcing the idea that the Old West was largely lawless when it came to weapons. Historical evidence paints a far more structured picture. While firearm ownership was common in Western territories, largely for hunting, pest control, and personal protection, many frontier towns imposed strict regulations on carrying weapons within town limits. These rules were intended to maintain order in crowded commercial areas where disputes could quickly escalate. In numerous Western towns, visitors were required to leave their firearms outside town or temporarily surrender them to local authorities upon arrival. Dodge City, Kansas, often remembered as one of the most unruly cattle towns of the era, enforced such policies openly. A large, well-known sign in the center of town made the rule unmistakable. The public carrying of firearms was not permitted. Similar ordinances existed in places such as Abilene, Wichita, Deadwood, and Tombstone. These regulations were not merely symbolic. Town leaders understood that businesses, saloons, hotels, and gambling halls brought together large numbers of people in close quarters. Limiting weapons in these spaces was a practical response aimed at reducing accidents and maintaining civic stability, rather than an attempt to disarm the population entirely. The famous confrontation near the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, illustrates how seriously these laws were taken. The incident unfolded after local law enforcement attempted to enforce existing ordinances requiring firearms to be surrendered within city limits. Rather than being an example of lawlessness, the episode highlights how disputes often centered on the enforcement of local regulations rather than their absence. Legal historian Adam Winkler has noted that Tombstone's firearm laws during the 1880s were, in many respects, more restrictive than those currently in place. This observation underscores a broader reality of the frontier. Western towns frequently exercised strong local authority and enacted clear rules to govern daily life. Overall, the idea of an unregulated, weapon-filled Old West is largely a product of later storytelling. While firearms were part of frontier life, their use and public presence were commonly shaped by local laws, social expectations, and practical concerns. Far from being chaotic free-for-alls, many Western towns actively worked to impose order through regulation and community enforcement. Number 6. The typical frontiersman was a romantic figure. Popular depictions of cowboys and frontier lawmen often present them as romantic figures. On screen, they appear well-groomed and composed, either quiet, stoic professionals or gallant heroes who arrive just in time, dressed in clean shirts and polished boots. This image has become deeply embedded in how modern audiences imagine the Old West. The reality of frontier life, however, was far less refined. Cowboys and lawmen spent long days outdoors, working closely with livestock and traveling great distances under harsh conditions. Clean clothing was a luxury, not a daily expectation, and personal comfort ranked far below survival and productivity. Regular bathing was uncommon, largely due to limited access to clean water, soap, and spare clothing. Trails, cattle drives, and remote settlements offered few opportunities for proper hygiene. As a result, strong odors were an unavoidable part of everyday life on the frontier, especially for those who worked directly with animals. Author and historian Harry E. Chrisman noted that cowboys often carried the persistent smells of horses and cattle and rarely had the means to wash thoroughly. Facial hair, worn for warmth or practicality, frequently went untrimmed for long periods. In such conditions, beards could easily harbor parasites such as lice or fleas, which were widespread across 19th century populations regardless of social class. Medical understanding at the time was also limited. Skin infections and irritations, such as barber's itch, a common fungal condition, were difficult to prevent or treat, especially among men who shared equipment, bedding, and grooming tools. These issues were not unique to the West, but frontier living amplified them due to isolation and scarce medical resources. Historical photographs, diaries, and army records consistently show that frontier clothing was worn until it wore out, not until it became soiled. Appearance mattered far less than durability, warmth, and practicality. The polished, freshly laundered cowboy of modern westerns owes far more to 20th century filmmaking standards than to 19th century reality. Understanding these conditions helps strip away the romantic veneer and replace it with a more honest picture of frontier life. Cowboys and lawmen were not storybook figures living in cinematic perfection. They were working people enduring physically demanding environments where cleanliness was often sacrificed to necessity. Number 7. All cowboys were white. Classic Western films have strongly shaped public perception of who cowboys were. Iconic actors such as John Wayne, Gary Cooper, James Stewart, and Clint Eastwood helped cement an image of the cowboy as overwhelmingly white. For decades, this narrow portrayal dominated movies, television, and popular culture, leaving little room for alternative narratives. Historical evidence, however, reveals a far more diverse reality. Scholars estimate that as many as 1 in 4 working cowboys in the United States were black. In the decades following the Civil War, many formerly enslaved African Americans sought employment opportunities in the West, where ranching offered steady work, wages, food, and relative mobility compared to life in the post-war South. Ranch work often placed greater emphasis on skill and reliability than on background. While discrimination certainly existed, the practical demands of frontier ranching meant that experienced riders, ropers, and handlers were valued regardless of race. Black cowboys played essential roles on cattle drives, ranch operations, and trail crews, even though their contributions were largely erased from later popular storytelling. The cultural roots of cowboy life extend even further back and beyond U.S. borders. Long before the rise of the American cowboy, Spanish colonists introduced cattle ranching traditions to the Americas in the 16th century. These practices took hold most strongly in what is now Mexico, where skilled cattle herders, known as vaqueros, developed techniques, equipment, and terminology that still define cowboy culture today. By the late 19th century, Mexican cowboys made up a substantial portion of the Western workforce. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 cowboys during this period were Mexican or of Mexican descent. From roping styles and saddles to chaps, spurs, and even common ranching vocabulary, much of what is now considered classic cowboy culture has direct vaquero origins. The familiar image of the white solitary cowboy is therefore a product of selective memory rather than historical accuracy. In reality, the Old West was shaped by a multicultural workforce that included black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, indigenous ranch workers, and European immigrants. Recognizing this diversity not only corrects long-standing myths, but also offers a more honest and inclusive understanding of frontier history. Number 8. Gunfights in the violent Wild West. Modern portrayals of the Old West often give the impression that frontier towns were overwhelmed by constant lethal crime. Popular culture encourages us to imagine famous cattle towns as places where confrontations happen daily and casualties mounted by the dozens. This image, while dramatic, does not align with what historical records actually show. In reality, even the most notorious Western towns experience surprisingly low homicide rates. The highest number of killings recorded in any single Old West town during a given year was 5, and that figure represents an extreme outlier. Most frontier towns average closer to 1 or 2 homicides per year, and many years pass without any at all. Importantly, not all of these incidents involve firearms. Tombstone, Arizona, often cited as a symbol of frontier lawlessness, provides a useful example. In 1881, the year of its most famous confrontation, the town recorded 3 homicides, marking its most violent year on record. By comparison, modern American cities routinely experience far higher rates of violent crime. Statistically speaking, an individual living in a major U.S. city in the early 21st century faced a greater risk of homicide than someone living in Tombstone during its most infamous period. The cinematic version of the classic Western gunfight also fails under closer examination. Handguns of the 19th century were mechanically limited, slow to reload, and notably inaccurate. Engaging a target at even modest distances was difficult, making the idea of precision-based quick-draw skill largely irrelevant. Hitting a target quickly was far more dependent on chance than on speed or dramatic flair. When formal one-on-one confrontations did occur, they more closely resembled static duels than the choreographed standoffs seen in movies. Participants typically stood at a distance with weapons already drawn, and outcomes depended largely on luck rather than technical mastery. Even then, such events were rare enough to become famous precisely because they were unusual. Many familiar gun handling techniques shown in films, such as rapid-fire cocking of single-action revolvers, are also products of fiction. Contemporary accounts and mechanical realities suggest these methods offered little practical advantage and were unlikely to improve accuracy. Their popularity owes far more to visual storytelling than to historical practice. So why does the myth of the hyper-violent Old West persist? One reason lies in reputation building. Certain well-known figures exaggerated their personal exploits to enhance their notoriety, while frontier towns sometimes promoted a dangerous image to attract attention, business, and adventurous settlers. Sensational stories sold newspapers, books, and later, movie tickets. Once motion pictures and pulp novels spread these narratives, few people felt motivated to challenge them. The exaggerated version of the West was more exciting, easier to market, and far more memorable than the quieter truth of frontier life, governed by local laws, community norms, and practical problem-solving. The Old West was never as simple or as wild as the stories made it seem. Over time, Hollywood, dime novels, and popular folklore transformed a complex, multicultural, and often surprisingly orderly frontier into a land of constant chaos and exaggerated heroics. When we strip away the myths, what remains is a far more interesting reality, one shaped by hard work, local laws, cooperation, and everyday survival rather than endless showdowns and lawlessness. Understanding the real Old West doesn't ruin the legend, it deepens it. Now we'd love to hear from you. Which Old West myth surprised you the most, or which one did you believe for years? Leave a comment and join the discussion below. And if you enjoy uncovering the real history behind America's most legendary frontier, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the myths, facts, and forgotten truths of the Old West.